Tessmar-Raible, welcome to Where the Wild Thoughts Are.
Many thanks for the invitation.
Have you always been interested in the moon? When you came into science, did you want to find out what the effects of the moon are? Or is that something that you were led to by the evidence as you went along?
Well, actually, I would have never thought that when I started to study biology, that I would end up doing a lot of research understanding the impact of the moon. I simply, in general, wasn't aware of the impact of time on biological organisms in general, solar time, also lunar time, but also because the moon obviously has also some pseudoscientific aspects often associated with it. And I come from a very strong medical family background, and so this would have been almost the least that I would have thought I would go into. But as it turns out, there is real scientific evidence or clear data, especially in marine organisms. And so there is actually quite some fascinating biology that's connected to lunar timing.
But there's also a lot of stories and mythology around human connections to the moon as well.
Yes, and this is particularly fascinating, of course. So what does it mean for us? And I mean, my short answer to this as a biologist is that we don't know. But of course, humans are just another type of animal for biologists. And so, of course, the moon is just another timing system. And as a matter of fact, there is increasing evidence on sleep timing as well as on reproductive timing, that at least there are, I would call this, remnants of lunar timing still present in today's humans.
Yeah, when you put it like that, as in, well, it's just another environmental cue and humans are just another animal, it makes it sound completely natural that we might be affected by the moon. But it's interesting how anti this idea research did become for a while. You used the word pseudoscience, and I've read scientific reviews using exactly that word, pseudoscience. So why do you think that it became such a negative topic for a lot of researchers?
Why are scientists afraid of the moon? And so, why is this? And one of the answers that a colleague gave is that it's nothing that's probably specific to lunar timing. Whenever there is a new field collecting data and changing the way how we think, it's first met with quite some resistance.
So you don't think it's because there's been, all of the mythology and the stories and the beliefs around the moon and, I don't know, werewolves at full moon and the moon and births and pregnancies. And there's something about these stories that almost made researchers not want to go there in a way because it just doesn't feel scientific.
Certainly the fact that there is a lot of methodology around this. And yeah, as you mentioned, werewolves, this certainly doesn't help when it comes to scientific methodology. What I realized is that when I myself talk about the scientific data, that it's much easier for also people to understand that there may be something also for humans if we come along the way from the animal evidence. And then showing that, for instance, in the case of reproductive timing, this even spans to the great apes, I think especially gorillas. And so now the jump between gorillas and us is, in an evolutionary perspective, really minor. And so then I think people start to see, hey, there is not so much myth about this. And then the acceptance is getting much higher because it's also better understandable. People want to understand how this can be. And then it's not so difficult anymore. I think one of the problems is also there were lots of these stories around, but then by the same time, there was not really an explanation. And why should humans be influenced by the moon? But when one then comes from the aspect of timing and why it is important that we also have calendars because we have to meet at the same day somehow, then suddenly people start to understand, it also makes sense. And I think it's this, it kind of makes sense, that then also starts to trigger the process, maybe it's not so crazy after all.
All right, so let's follow that path then from the rest of nature, and then we'll come back to humans. Before we look at the mechanisms, because you've really pioneered work on that, could you give some examples? What are some of the most sort of colourful or dramatic examples of other species that follow sort of behavioural patterns that are linked to the moon?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the most famous ones, the two that I like to highlight are the corals. Basically, corals from reefs across the world have a timing that's not only timed to particular hours of the day, but also days during the months. On this timing of days during the months, this is actually lunar timing. And this is causing this is synchronizing these mass reproductive events that from the coral reefs, I've read that for the Great Barrier Reef, for instance, this is so precisely timed and such a mass spawning event that it's even visible from space. Now, I haven't seen it myself, but I can imagine because they are all just synchronized to these particular days. So this is a very striking example and probably also an ecologically very relevant example if one thinks about what does it mean when all of these massive organic materials actually also released, and how important it is that the next generation is formed. And so this is one aspect. The other one that's also quite famous, some people may have seen this in the news, that the red crabs of the Christmas Islands are marching again. So the number is about 50 million. 50 million adult crabs are normally distributed across the island, in the forest of the island, and they are living quite solitary as individuals. And then during a particular season, this is also seasonal timing, and then a particular moon phase, they will have their gonads and also their behavior changed and ready for reproduction. And there are these videos that show very beautifully how they march down to the beaches in order to reproduce. And I think the island is even blocked off for this because there are the crabs just merging. And that is the timing of the moon. So this is another beautiful example. There are various fishes also. There are pufferfish in Japan, for instance, that are also having these mass spawning events at the coast of Japan. Very interesting, very fascinating phenomena. So it's mussel, sea urchins. It's very widespread.
Mm. And how about non-marine species? Because there are terrestrial species and even plants as well that are following the moon.
So on the level of the terrestrial species, this is less well documented. So there are a couple of reports. For instance, the European dagger supposedly has this, certain species of mayflies, also mass reproductive events. The kind of common denominator always seems to be timing of reproduction. Then there are also reports from, as I mentioned already, specific great apes, gorillas, also macaques that are timing their reproduction according to the lunar cycle. On the side of the plants, this is a very interesting question. There is a lot of myth around this, when to have to cut certain plants and so on. There are some Israeli colleagues, they have now started to look into this from a scientific perspective to really, because apparently there's also quite some, let's say, rules that are given when what should be planted and harvested according to the lunar cycle. And it's not clear if there is a scientific basis to it, but this they are currently investigating. There is one example that I'm aware of, which is the Peruvian apple cactus that flowers according to the lunar cycle. But this is pretty much the best documented as far as I know. But it certainly is one thing that comes up also for terrestrial animals, seems to be that the more you shine the light on it, the more you can actually find connections.
You've given examples of a sort of across life there: plants, corals, fish, insects, mammals. And I guess from what you were saying earlier, what's changed recently is the ability to actually get at the mechanisms of some of that. What have you been working on in terms of getting models in the lab to really get a sense of how animals are timing this and responding to lunar cycles?
So one of our most, let's say, relevant models that we have in the lab is this bristleworm that I mentioned in the beginning. It's basically like a earthworm with many legs. It's related to earthworms, but has lots of legs, and lives in the marine environment. And it was the first one where it has been described that a lunar cycle can actually reproduce in the laboratory with artificial light. This all goes back to this German professor Karl Hauenschild, who took them actually into the lab in the 1950s because he was curious about these reports on the lunar cycle. And so there, for this worm, we've established all kinds of, we call this molecular tools, so where we can take out certain cell types, we can disrupt genes and ask if we change this gene, what will happen to the ability of the worm to still follow the lunar cycle, yes or no. We can stain for the nervous system specific types of neurons. And so it gives us the possibility to really ask, now, if we change something there, what happens? And this is the way how science works.
And this is the phases of the moon that the worm is responding to?
So I have to take a little bit, a step back to understanding how timing works. And so in principle, it's always two ways how organisms can time processes. One is that you can directly respond to an environmental stimulus. Let's say it's getting hot outside and we retract inside. And of course, in summer, it's often getting hot during noontime, so we will go inside during noontime. But it's not something that we have to do intrinsically. But it follows, in this case, an about 24-hour cycle in summer. Now, there's something else that we do on a 24-hour cycle, which is sleep. And we will know, and we all know when we had a jet lag, that the sleep will actually come at a certain time that was a previous time where we were before we traveled, for instance. And this is the other way how organisms can time processes, and these are so-called inner oscillators, inner timers or inner clocks. And so many people have heard about these inner daily oscillators, which have to do with the jet lag, which is why I refer to them. But that's not only the case for daily timers, but it's also true for these monthly lunar timers. So in other words, what the worms have is an inner calendar system, I like to call it an inner calendar system, which has a time period of about a month. And so this inner calendar will run independently of any light stimulus or something. It has an inner calendar, but it gets calibrated by the full moon night. So that each of the different worms in the populations know, this was the full moon now we all start our calendar. Because of course, if they all start the calendar at a different time, that's bad, because then they're not synchronized. So you can, in analogy, also take, for instance, the Islamic calendar system, where they time according to the moon. I think there the timing, the synchronization is the rise of the first visible sign of the waxing moon after new moon. And so this is, we humans, for our calendar systems, in this case, do this too. The worms, they just use the full moon. And so that's what the full moon does. And so in the lab, we give them 6 to 8 nights of constant light at night, dim constant light at night, and that synchronizes their calendar systems. And then these calendars will show their monthly timing, even if we don't show them the nocturnal light anymore.
Is it essentially two different clocks, like a solar clock and a lunar clock that you see in these organisms, or is it all just entwined into different aspects of the same clock with some of the same molecular components?
This is also an interesting question, and we haven't really all worked this out. We don't. So for the monthly timer, what I call the inner calendar system, we don't know at the moment what the oscillator is. And so we, however, know that it seems that you can get rid of the daily timing system and it doesn't matter. So this argues to us that at least for this monthly inner calendar system, the daily timing system as such is not necessarily required. What it is, we don't know. This is a little different, as a side note, from the tidal timing. So when people talk about lunar timing, often they also connect this with the tidal timing, but the duration of the tides is much shorter. So this is 12.4 hours, right? And of course, this is connected to the moon too. And there it seems that at least some of the molecules that are involved in daily timing also play a role in this tidal timing. But that's not what I'm talking about, because the monthly timing that I'm talking about is much longer. This has a period length of many days, 29.5 days in essence.
What kind of things with this monthly oscillator is that governing in these species? So you already mentioned things like mass spawnings, but are there other aspects of their lives and their behaviour that are tied to this timing rhythm?
What is the moon influencing, in short words, as I understand? And what we learn more and more, it's actually probably almost everything in these organisms. And when you think about it, first I was very surprised when the way how we look at this as biologists is we then look at the amount of transcripts, which type of transcripts that are basically then the molecules that then are responsible for making the proteins. So, and they tell us something about what's active and what's inactive when they appear and disappear. And so we can ask, how are they changing according to the lunar cycle? This is one way how we can look into many different pathways and see, what is affected. And so when we look into this, we find that there are lots of different things affected: metabolism, physiology, behavior. So this was to us at the beginning quite surprising, I have to say. Now thinking about it, if you think about what reproduction is and what it means to prepare for being ready for the next, for producing the next generation, it actually means that you have to change the physiology as a worm. So the worms become basically bags full of sperm and egg. So this is like they are massively restructuring their body. They change their behavior, so there has to be a lot of stuff going on also in the nervous system. And finally, of course, there are the gonads. But there is this very strong intertwine between all of these different processes. And hence, not surprisingly, we see that lots of different processes are affected. And when you look at us humans, to make maybe the leap, when you think about what happens when people have these reproductive cycles as a woman, of course we have lots of hormones changing. And of course these hormones influence behavior and physiology too.
So what do we know about how much of this translates from these marine species into other species like humans?
At the moment, the interesting thing that we see for the bristleworm is that molecules that are changing in connection with the lunar cycle in the bristleworm, many of those have then evolutionarily related proteins also in humans. And this particularly also is connected to, for instance, the hormonal system, enzymes that produce certain hormones, or also there are peptide hormones, as they are called. So these are small proteins basically that can also have hormonal functions. And so several of those are changing with the lunar cycle in the worms. So we see quite some similarities there. But the proof of connection is something we still have to work on to check if it's really true.
So in the worms, you've got this we know at least that there is a molecular monthly oscillator, even if you don't know the details of everything that's happening. And we know that some of those components are also found in humans, or related components are found in humans. And then we see this monthly cycle, which is 29.5 days on average, the human reproductive, or the menstrual cycle, is that right?
Yeah, depends on the age apparently. Our cycle, I think for younger human females, is around 29 days. That then gets a little bit longer. I think over the age of 35 or 40, then it starts to become 30 or a bit longer than 30 days. And just as a side note, also the daily timer, so the circadian, well-characterized circadian clock that we humans have for sure, changes the period length as a function of age. So this is not even something that would be peculiar for our monthly timing. And so yes, the monthly oscillator in humans is per definition a circulunar oscillator. It has the period length of exactly this. Why this is, again, is a different question.
Yeah, well, because there seems to have been something that's so difficult to pin down. If you look at studies, there are some studies seem to be able to pin menstrual cycles to particular phases of the moon, and then other studies will pin it to a different phase of the moon, and then other studies will not see any link to the moon at all. So it's difficult to do the molecular studies in humans, but what do we know about what those sort of behavioral links are?
Oh, I think for the menstrual cycle, there is now this work, especially from Charlotte Heffery Forster, but also from other people in the field, meanwhile, that can say that there are statistically significant peaks clearly for new moon and full moon. So interestingly, it's not just one moon phase, it's two, and it's new moon and full moon, funnily enough. Which, by the way, is something we also see in worms. So they can also make this biphasic. It's meaning having two peaks during the lunar cycle, and then it's the new moon and the full moon are similar. So this is quite interesting. It's the same like in humans in that way. But this is, I would say, meanwhile, statistically quite well worked out. When people take into account that, of course, one has to rely on data that are, for instance, taken from people not taking contraceptives. And also it seems to be that artificial light, and especially in the blue light range, impacts on our daily, but also probably on the human female monthly timing system. So there is a very recent study from Charlotte Heffery Forster going into this and dividing data from the time before the blue light LEDs were introduced versus after. And it seems to be that especially this introduction of the blue light LEDs correlates with a decrease in the synchronization. But overall, especially when taking data from like really decades ago, and some of these records are still existing from women who didn't take contraceptives during that time, it's very difficult to argue away that there are these statistical correlations which are pretty clear. The only way one could say is, these are just statistical outliers. But then it starts to get a lot of statistical outliers. And then for me as a biologist, there is then, okay, isn't it the easier explanation that if this is true for female gorillas, I mean, the difference is not so big.
And do we know anything about what the implications might be then? It sounds like you're saying in modern life, it's actually a lot harder to see that link because of the artificial light exposure. Is that going to be a problem for fertility, or is this just something that's completely not researched?
So one thing for humans that I found quite fascinating is, although there is a lot of research into fertility and we know a lot about the FSH, or the hormonal surges, there is the so-called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and the luteinizing hormone, LH, and estrogen that has to have certain peaks in relation to each other and so on. We know a lot about this. But we don't really understand why in a human female the period of that cycle is about a month. And it's not that this is all determined by our gonads autonomously. There is a very, let's say, little understood relationship between the brain, specifically a region of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is a hormonal gland, basically, a brain hormonal gland, and our gonads. And this interplay, it's a hormonal interplay, some things are understood, but why this exactly has this timing and how it comes that in some people then, for instance, there is not the levels are not reached high enough so that at the end the egg can I don't know how you call this in English, jump. In German we say jump.
Be released, just to ovulate. Yeah, be released.
So be released. So I'm a German, so
we'll say jump. That's fine.
The egg is jumping. The egg is released. This is more scientific. So this is not clear. And so what I hope, what we can also help is that by understanding how this timing works in a worm, to better understand how the exact monthly timing can work in humans.
What about other effects of the moon on humans? So what about sleep or mental health, for example?
Yeah, so there are these very interesting studies from particularly Horacio de Iglesia, Christian Tessmar-Raible, Thomas Wehr, who show that there are, again, correlations, but quite strong correlations between sleep duration, especially, and also sleep onset and the phase of the moon. It's not such a big change it's statistically visible, but it's something that is, I would say, for the well-being in general of a person, probably not a big problem for a healthy human. What is interesting from the psychological perspective is that especially Thomas Wehr, who is a psychologist, he had for a long time, he studied bipolar patients. And what he observed was that in the correlation with the change in the sleep timing, there was a clear association associated with this for their mental state. So they did this switch from depressive to maniac or manic to depressive. And of course, as a side note, then the question is, maybe this is where the werewolves came from, right? Because in certain humans, it seems to be that the mental state is affected by sleep duration, probably. And the sleep duration in turn seems to somehow depend on this lunar timing. And so this is where this may come from. And then, again, just add the like of storytelling in humans and exaggeration, and you may come to the werewolves at some point.
Well, it's so interesting, isn't it? You've got these ancient stories of the shellfish changing in size with the moon and with the werewolves and linked to sort of mental state. I mean, we've got, the words lunatic coming from Lunar and moonsick as well, I think, is from Monsiok, the Old English. So we've got these links that then become dismissed. And now we're coming to realize, actually, the whole story might not be true, but there was a grain of truth in the center of that we're now rediscovering.
Yes, exactly. So I sometimes think of this like I like to think of this like the excavators that go according to certain stories that are there in the human like myth, and that sometimes there is a true core in this, and we just have to unearth that. And as a biologist, now we can.